It was 9:15 in the morning on Sunday, November 24th, 1985, at the Annapolis Hilton, in room 317, Federal Bureau of Investigation. Special Agent David Faulkner sat across from a balding, sandy-haired man with graying temples. The man was 44 years old. His red hair was fading to auburn. He had been selling boats for a living, working for Safford Yacht Sales at the marina. This seemed like a normal life and a normal job. However, nothing about this man was normal. Faulkner recognized his voice. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had a tape, 5 years old, of a phone call to the Soviet Embassy in Washington. The call was placed on January 14th, 1980. The voice on that tape perfectly matched the voice of the man sitting across from him now, Ronald William Pelton. Pelton was a former National Security Agency analyst. According to a committee for state security defector who remembered his red hair, Pelton was one of the most damaging spies in American history. Faulkner laid out all they knew, every detail, every date, and every meeting. Pelton listened silently at first. Then something broke. The man who walked into the Soviet embassy with only $6.80 in his pocket began admitting and confessing. Within 5 hours, he would be in handcuffs. However, in this hotel room, the biggest question remained. How did a trusted National Security Agency employee with 14 years of service become a Soviet spy? What made him sell one of America's most closely guarded submarine secrets for $35,000? The answer began with a bankruptcy filing in July 1979 at the Howard County, Maryland District Court. Ronald William Pelton listed his debts at $64,650. Under assets, he wrote down the most pathetic inventory imaginable. He had cash on hand of $6.80. His checking account balance was $8. His assets also included 4 old, broken-down cars and 1 motorcycle that did not run. He also owned a $10 wristwatch, a bowling ball, 5 pairs of shoes, and 1 razor. That was everything he owned after 14 years working for the most powerful intelligence agency in America. His house was half built on a plot of land in rural Howard County. Building materials kept getting stolen from the construction site. His wife Judith and their 4 children lived in what neighbors described as a rundown shack near a dump. Pelton was making $24,500 a year at the National Security Agency. This was not enough to finish the house. It was also insufficient to feed his family properly. Furthermore, it did not stop the creditors from calling. The financial strain had been building for years. He had started several side businesses, trying to sell recreational vehicles, do landscaping work, and offer computer consulting. Nothing worked. All his ventures failed, and the debt kept mounting. Now, filing bankruptcy, he faced another problem. The National Security Agency did not like employees with financial troubles. Such employees were considered security risks, vulnerable to recruitment by foreign intelligence services. Pelton knew these rules. He had even helped write some of them during his 14 years in the agency's Soviet Communications Division. Ronald William Pelton was born on November 18, 1941, in Benton Harbor, Michigan. His father managed the electronics department at Whirlpool and repaired televisions. His stepmother was a homemaker. Pelton knew almost nothing about his biological mother, as she was absent from his childhood entirely. He grew up middle class, but never wealthy. He was a smart kid, graduating in 1960 in the upper quarter of his high school class. He was good with languages and had an excellent memory. Pelton was also gifted at music, particularly the piano and organ. In 1961, Pelton joined the United States Air Force. The Air Force sent him to Indiana University to study Russian, where he excelled. Fluency came naturally to him. The Air Force deployed him to Peshawar, Pakistan in the early 1960s. His job was a voice intercept processing specialist. He listened to Soviet communications, translated them, and analyzed them. 15 months in Pakistan taught him how Soviet military communications worked. He learned how they talked, how they thought, and how they operated. When he left active duty, the Air Force transferred him to a civilian position at the National Security Agency. This occurred in 1965 at Fort Meade, Maryland. This was the largest and most secretive intelligence organization in the world. At the National Security Agency, Pelton found his calling. He worked in the Soviet Communications Unit. This involved signals intelligence, breaking codes, and intercepting transmissions. His goal was understanding how the enemy communicated. He had top secret clearance with access to what the National Security Agency called special compartmented information. These projects were so sensitive that only people cleared into specific compartments could know they existed. Pelton received clearance into many compartments. Too many, some officials would later admit. His superiors considered him brilliant, an oracle on Soviet communications, and a troubleshooter who understood everything. He knew which signals the National Security Agency had successfully attacked. He also knew where the intercept equipment was located. He understood how the Soviets encoded their messages and how America had cracked some of those codes. Furthermore, he knew the locations of underwater cable taps. He also knew about satellite intercepts and listening posts hidden around the world. His encyclopedic knowledge made him valuable and indispensable. However, it also made him catastrophically dangerous when he needed money. In 1962, at age 21, Pelton married Judith Ann Wysong. They had 4 children together. By the time Pelton filed bankruptcy, 2 daughters were married, and 2 teenage children were still at home. The family struggled financially, despite his National Security Agency salary. Pelton worked side jobs constantly, selling products and trying business ventures. He also quoted scripture to friends. He volunteered at a soup kitchen in downtown Washington, feeding homeless people, and played organ at church. By all accounts, he was a good man, a hard worker, and had a pleasant personality. He told jokes and did not complain much. However, the financial pressure was crushing him underneath. The bankruptcy filing in July 1979 forced Pelton's hand. He resigned from the National Security Agency 3 days after declaring bankruptcy. He feared the agency would discover his financial problems and revoke his clearance. Alternatively, he might face increased scrutiny. Once an employee left the National Security Agency, their clearances were automatically revoked. Pelton walked out of Fort Meade in July 1979. He had 14 years of service and 14 years of secrets, all stored in his extraordinary memory. No documents were needed, just the knowledge stored in his head. He tried to make it work legitimately, taking a job with William Valois Sr. at a landscaping firm. This paid $21,000 a year, less than he had made at the National Security Agency. That lasted 2 years. He sold boats and cars, offered computer consulting, and tried real estate. He also pursued something called international money shuffling. There were always high hopes and big promises. However, none of it paid the bills. By Christmas 1979, Pelton was desperate. 6 months out of the National Security Agency, he had no money, and his family was barely surviving. Creditors were calling, and the shame of bankruptcy was still fresh. Then he had an idea. A terrible and catastrophic idea. He would later tell Federal Bureau of Investigation agents that desperate people do crazy things when they are broke. On Monday afternoon, January 14th, 1980, Ronald Pelton picked up a telephone. It was a public, untraceable payphone, not his home phone. He dialed the Soviet Embassy in Washington, District of Columbia. A voice answered in Russian. Pelton explained in English that he was a member of the United States government. He claimed to have valuable information and wanted to meet. The voice on the other end was cautious but interested. They arranged a meeting for the next night, January 15th, At 8 in the evening, Pelton hung up, having just crossed a line he could never uncross. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had surveillance on the Soviet embassy. This was standard procedure, involving wiretaps on the phone lines, cameras on the entrances, and agents watching who came and went. They intercepted Pelton's call. They knew someone claiming to be a government employee wanted to meet. They anticipated the caller's arrival the next evening. The agents prepared with cameras ready and positioned themselves. However, Pelton outsmarted them. He did not show up on Tuesday night. Instead, he arrived on Tuesday afternoon, January 15th, 1980, at 2 in the afternoon. It was the middle of the day. He had no beard yet and wore no disguise. Just a desperate man walking into enemy territory with secrets to sell. The Federal Bureau of Investigation surveillance team was not ready. They watched him enter, but could not get a good identification. They captured only his medium height, sandy hair with a red tint, and slight balding. Inside the embassy, Pelton met with Vitaly Yurchenko, a Committee for State Security officer. Yurchenko was a colonel in the Committee for State Security, 1st Chief Directorate. He was 43 years old, with blonde hair, a handlebar mustache, an athletic build, and a scar on his right hand. He was an experienced intelligence officer. Yurchenko had served as security chief at the Soviet embassy in Washington from 1975 to 1979. He knew American walk-ins, how to assess them, and the questions to ask. Yurchenko began the debriefing, asking about Pelton's identity, knowledge, National Security Agency access, and tenure. Pelton answered everything. He had no documents in hand, only his memory, his encyclopedic knowledge, and his 14 years of secrets pouring out. Yurchenko quickly realized this was legitimate. This man knew real and valuable things, and the Committee for State Security would pay for this information. They talked for hours. When it was time for Pelton to leave, Yurchenko gave him instructions. He instructed Pelton to grow a beard and return in a few days. They would then set up another meeting and discuss payment. Pelton left the embassy that evening. The Federal Bureau of Investigation surveillance team tried to identify him but failed. He walked out a back entrance, boarded an embassy shuttle bus with other employees, and changed clothes to match embassy staff. The beard would come later. For now, he had successfully made contact and was officially a Soviet spy. Over the next 3 weeks, Pelton grew the beard as instructed. He returned to the Soviet embassy several times. Each time, he provided more information from memory. Yurchenko took detailed notes and asked specific questions. He focused on signals, intelligence, including Soviet communications the National Security Agency had successfully intercepted. This included broken codes, equipment locations, methods, and sources. During one of these meetings, Pelton revealed the crown jewel, the one secret that would do more damage than anything else. He told Yurchenko about Operation Ivy Bells. Bob Woodward would later describe it in his book, Veil. He called it one of the most advanced and sophisticated, miniaturized waterproof eavesdropping devices in existence. According to historian Timothy Naftali, this underwater system had produced one of the greatest intelligence hauls of the Cold War. However, Ronald Pelton sold it to the Russians for $5,000. $5,000, that was what the Committee for State Security paid him specifically for Operation Ivy Bells. This secret had cost billions to develop and operate. It risked American lives every month when Navy divers serviced the tap 400 feet underwater in hostile Soviet territorial waters. The secret was so valuable that revealing it would permanently damage America's ability to monitor Soviet nuclear submarine operations. All this for $5,000. Operation Ivy Bells began in October 1971. The United States government learned of an undersea communications cable in the Sea of Okhotsk. This sea lies between the Kamchatka Peninsula and the eastern Soviet Union coastline. The area was remote and heavily guarded. The Soviets claimed the entire sea as territorial waters. This made it strictly off limits to foreign vessels. They had installed a network of sound detection devices along the seabed to detect intruders. Surface and subsurface naval exercises happened constantly, making it dangerous water to enter. However, the prize was worth the risk. The cable connected the major Soviet Pacific Fleet naval base at Petropavlovsk on Kamchatka. This connected to the Pacific Fleet mainland headquarters at Vladivostok. All communications between these two critical military installations traveled through that cable. If the United States could tap that cable, they would hear everything. This included ship movements, submarine deployments, and nuclear weapons status. It would also reveal strategic plans. A joint mission launched to make this happen. This mission involved the National Security Agency, the United States Navy, and the Central Intelligence Agency. They called it Operation Ivy Bells. The mission required a specially modified submarine. This was the USS Halibut, submarine number 587. It was nuclear-powered and specially fitted for covert operations. In October 1971, the Halibut slipped into Soviet territorial waters undetected. The submarine descended to 400 feet. Navy divers exited the vessel into the freezing depths of the Sea of Okhotsk. They located the 5-inch communications cable running along the seafloor. Using specialized equipment designed by American Telephone and Telegraph Bell Laboratories, they installed a 20-foot-long recording device directly onto the cable. The device was powered by a radioisotope thermoelectric generator. It could store a year's worth of intercepted communications. This installation was a masterpiece of engineering and courage. The divers worked in near total darkness, in hostile waters, and in enemy territory. One mistake could lead to their capture or death. One mistake could also expose the entire operation. They succeeded. The tap was in place. It was operational and silent. For the next 10 years, Operation Ivy Bells provided intelligence gold. Each month, American submarines returned to service the device. Different submarines participated over the years. These included the USS Parche and the USS Richard B. Russell. Each month, divers retrieved the recording tapes and installed fresh ones. The recordings were delivered to the National Security Agency for processing. Ronald Pelton worked on some of those tapes. That is how he knew about Ivy Bells. He had seen the raw intelligence and understood its value. He also knew the cable's exact location. The first tapes revealed something shocking. The Soviets were so confident in the cable's security that they transmitted most communications unencrypted. There were no codes and no protection. Just raw military communications flowed between senior Soviet officers. The intelligence proved invaluable. It provided details about Petropavlovsk operations. Petropavlovsk was the Pacific Fleet's primary nuclear submarine base. It was home to Yankee-class and Delta-class nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarines. Every movement was tracked, every plan revealed, and every deployment monitored. The operation expanded over time. More taps were installed on Soviet lines in other parts of the world. More advanced instruments were built. More submarines were assigned to the mission. The technology improved and the intelligence haul grew. By 1980, Ivy Bells was one of America's most closely guarded secrets. Few people at the National Security Agency even knew it existed. It was classified as special compartmented information, available on a need-to-know basis only. Ronald Pelton was one of the people who knew. On a cold day in January 1980, he sat in the Soviet embassy with Committee for State Security, Colonel Vitaly Yurchenko. Pelton pointed to a map and showed them exactly where to find the tap. Pelton marked the location on a chart of the Sea of Okhotsk. His memory for technical details was extraordinary. However, his geographic memory was not perfect. He marked the wrong spot initially, but it was close enough. It indicated the general area. The Soviets would find it, and they did. However, it was not immediately. The Committee for State Security kept Pelton's information secret for months. They did not want to reveal their source. They waited, watched, and planned. Finally, in 1981, American surveillance satellites observed something concerning. Soviet warships anchored over the tap site. A salvage vessel was positioned directly above the device. They were retrieving it. Operation Ivy Bells was compromised. The mission was over. The 20-foot-long recording device was brought to the surface. It was examined and studied. As of 1999, it was on public display at the Great Patriotic War Museum in Moscow. It served as a trophy and proof of American espionage. All this happened because Ronald Pelton needed $5,000. Between January 1980 and January 1983, Pelton traveled to Vienna 2 times. The Committee for State Security arranged everything. This included plane tickets and hotel accommodations. He stayed at the residence of the Soviet ambassador to Austria, inside the Soviet embassy compound. There he was protected and secure. His debriefings lasted 8 hours a day, sometimes longer. Committee for State Security Officer Anatoly Slavnov conducted the sessions. Slavnov was thorough, professional, and relentless. He provided Pelton with written questions, and Pelton provided written answers. This continued hour after hour, day after day. Pelton revealed everything he remembered about National Security Agency operations. This included signals, intelligence programs, code-breaking capabilities, and equipment locations. He also shared information about sources and methods. Pelton's first Vienna trip happened in October 1980. He received $20,000 for that visit. It was all in cash. The second trip came in January 1983 for another $15,000. The total payments from the Soviets between 1980 and 1983 amounted to $35,000. Some accounts say $37,000. The exact figure varies by source, but it is somewhere between $35,000 and $37,000. For comparison, his entire National Security Agency salary for 14 years had totaled approximately $343,000. He sold America's deepest secrets for about 10% of what he had earned honestly. The math alone is staggering. With the Soviet money flowing in, Pelton's lifestyle changed dramatically. He went from a tumble-down shack in Howard County to maintaining 2 apartments in DuPont Circle, Washington, D.C. One apartment was for himself, and another was for his mistress. She was a former teenage beauty queen from suburban Maryland, who preferred to be called Anne. Pelton spent $500 a week entertaining her. He paid her $500 in monthly rent and covered all her bills. He took her to expensive restaurants, such as Old Angler's Inn in Potomac and Duke Zeibert's downtown. His favorite drink was Stolichnaya, a premier Russian vodka. This was an ironic choice for an American traitor. Anne recalled that Pelton promised her a trip to Europe the night they met in a suburban Maryland bar. He followed through on expensive promises. $200 evenings on the town became routine. He bought her antiques and supported her fully. She thought he owned 2 successful businesses. She never suspected the money came from Moscow. Sometimes she would ask if the money was good or bad. He never gave a straight answer. Pelton also supported his estranged wife, Judith. He gave her money for the 2 teenage children still at home. He also paid rent for one of his married daughters. He worked multiple jobs to maintain the illusion of legitimate income. These jobs included landscaping for William Valois, boat sales at Safford Yacht Sales, computer consulting, and health counseling. He also claimed to be involved in international money shuffling, using whatever he could as cover. Friends noticed the improvement. He went from being broke to comfortable. He transformed from desperate to generous. Nobody connected the dots, and nobody suspected. For 5 years, Ronald Pelton lived a double life. On the surface, he was an American boat salesman. Underneath, he was a Soviet spy. The secret held until August 1st, 1985. On August 1st, 1985, in the afternoon, a man walked into the United States Embassy in Rome, Italy. He was 49 years old, with blonde hair and a handlebar mustache. A scar marked his right hand. He told the Marine Guard he needed to speak with someone from the Central Intelligence Agency urgently. It was a defection. The Marine made a call. Within minutes, Central Intelligence Agency officers arrived. The man identified himself as Vitaly Sergeyevich Yurchenko. He was a colonel in the Committee for State Security 1st Chief Directorate, with 25 years of service. He was currently assigned to Rome. He stated he wanted to defect and sought a new life in America. He also wanted protection. In exchange, he offered valuable information. This included Soviet secrets and details about American traitors. The Central Intelligence Agency moved fast. They bundled Yurchenko out of Italy on August 2nd. He was flown by military aircraft to Andrews Air Force Base. Then he was taken to a Central Intelligence Agency safe house in Oakton, Virginia. This property spanned 10 acres and was isolated and secure. The debriefings began immediately. Aldrich Ames, a Central Intelligence Agency analyst, conducted the initial sessions. Federal Bureau of Investigation. Special Agent Michael Rochford joined them. Then, Colin Thompson, another Central Intelligence Agency analyst, became Yurchenko's primary handler. They taped and transcribed everything. The information circulated within the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Central Intelligence Agency. Yurchenko passed the initial verification tests. His knowledge of Committee for State Security Operations in Washington checked out. He had served as security chief at the Soviet Embassy from 1975 to 1979. He knew American intelligence capabilities. He also knew which Soviet personnel might be vulnerable and where the weaknesses were. The Americans believed him. He was legitimate. Then, Yurchenko started revealing names of American intelligence officers working for the Committee for State Security. There were about 60 assets total. Some were already known to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, while others were brand new leads. One name stood out immediately: Edward Lee Howard. He was a former Central Intelligence Agency officer. Howard had been fired in 1983 after failing polygraph tests. He had been briefed on Adolf Tolkachev, the Central Intelligence Agency's most valuable asset in Moscow. Yurchenko claimed Howard traveled to Vienna 2 times. These trips occurred in September 1984 and April 1985. He met with Committee for State Security officers both times. He provided information that led to Tolkachev's arrest. Howard became an immediate suspect. The Federal Bureau of Investigation began surveillance. However, Howard would escape to the Soviet Union before they could arrest him. He would spend the rest of his life in Moscow. He died by 2002. The other name Yurchenko provided was less specific, but more intriguing. He described a former National Security Agency analyst. He had met with this analyst in January 1980. The man had red hair. He had left the National Security Agency before walking into the Soviet embassy. He provided detailed information about signals intelligence operations. This analyst also told them about underwater cable tapping in the Sea of Okhotsk. Yurchenko did not know the man's name, only his description. He was a red-haired former National Security Agency analyst with an excellent memory. He had no documents, just knowledge. The Americans started digging. This could be catastrophic. Someone with National Security Agency access was selling signals intelligence secrets. They needed to find him fast. The Federal Bureau of Investigation scoured National Security Agency personnel files throughout September and October 1985. They looked for red-haired male analysts who left the agency between 1979 and 1980. The pool narrowed slowly. This involved background checks. They also reviewed employment records and financial histories. By October, they had their man. It was Ronald William Pelton. His red hair was fading to sandy brown. Pelton left the National Security Agency in July 1979. He filed bankruptcy the same month. He had only $6.80 cash to his name when he left. This provided perfect financial motivation. The timing was perfect, making him a perfect match. The Federal Bureau of Investigation pulled the 1980 surveillance tapes from the Soviet embassy. These tapes were from January 14th and 15th. They contained phone calls and a specific voice, The Bureau brought in voice analysis experts. The voice on the tape matched Pelton. This was a high-confidence identification. Now, the Bureau needed evidence. The Federal Bureau of Investigation began surveillance in October 1985. They bugged Pelton's car and his apartment in DuPont Circle. Agents followed him constantly. They watched his movements and recorded his conversations. His phone calls were monitored. For 6 weeks, they gathered nothing. There were no incriminating statements or suspicious meetings. He had no contact with Soviet handlers. The agents found no evidence that would hold up in court. The surveillance produced only one thing. It proved that Pelton knew he was being watched. In October, Pelton told his mistress, Anne, that changes were coming. He said there would be no more extra cash. He suggested they buy a yacht and leave the country. Pelton knew the walls were closing in. In October 1985, the surveillance continued. Pelton went about his life normally. He sold boats at Safford Yacht Sales in Annapolis. He also worked for William Valois, providing health counseling. Pelton maintained his 2 apartments and saw his mistress. However, his actions revealed awareness. He tried to contact the Soviets one more time earlier that year, in April 1985. He traveled to Vienna again. He borrowed a friend's credit card to cover expenses. Pelton spent several days walking in the designated meeting place, a park. The Soviets never approached him. This was possibly because Pelton had lost 75 pounds since his last Vienna meeting in 1983. Perhaps they did not recognize him. Alternatively, they may have already been suspicious. The Committee for State Security Counterintelligence might have suspected American surveillance. Whatever the reason, the meeting never happened. Pelton gave up after 3 days and flew home. He tried again later in 1985. This involved another planned Vienna trip in October. However, Pelton ran out of gas while driving to pick up his instructions and expense money. The trip never materialized. His spy career was effectively over, but he did not know it yet. The Federal Bureau of Investigation knew they had their man. The voice match was solid. The timeline fit perfectly. His financial motivation was clear. The defector's description also matched. However, they needed a confession. Without Vitaly Yurchenko's testimony in court, the case would be weak. Yurchenko was also about to become unavailable. On November 2nd, 1985, Yurchenko convinced his Central Intelligence Agency guard to take him shopping in Georgetown. They went to Au Pied de Cochon, a French restaurant at 1335, Wisconsin Avenue Northwest. Yurchenko asked his guard what he would do if Yurchenko got up and walked out. He asked if the guard would shoot him. The guard assured him that America does not shoot defectors. Yurchenko stood up. He announced that he was going for a walk. He added that if he did not come back, it would not be the guard's fault. Yurchenko did not come back. 20 minutes later, he reached the Soviet embassy. 3 months after defecting to the United States, Vitaly Yurchenko defected back to the Soviet Union. The Central Intelligence Agency was humiliated. The Federal Bureau of Investigation was furious. Their star witness against Ronald Pelton was gone. On November 4th, 1985, Soviet diplomats called a surprise press conference at the Soviet embassy in Washington. Reporters arrived to find Vitaly Yurchenko sitting at a dais in a suit and tie. He was flanked by Soviet officials. He opened with shaky English. He stated that he had not been able to speak Russian during the past 3 horrible months. Then he switched to his native language. He claimed the Americans had kidnapped him in Rome. They had drugged him and held him against his will at a safe house in Virginia. He asserted that the entire defection was involuntary. Yurchenko stated that he was a victim, and the Soviets were rescuing him. American officials were stunned. They wondered if Yurchenko was a legitimate defector who changed his mind. Alternatively, he might have been a plant sent to fool the Central Intelligence Agency all along. Theories multiplied. Some believed he was protecting Aldrich Ames. Ames was the Central Intelligence Agency mole who had helped debrief him. Ames had been secretly working for the Committee for State Security since April 1985. Perhaps Yurchenko's defection was designed to divert attention. Others believed he was genuine, but regretted his choice. He was lovesick for a woman in Canada who rejected him. He was also sick with a stomach ulcer that American doctors could not cure. Furthermore, he was frustrated that his defection leaked to the media despite promises of secrecy. Whatever the truth, Yurchenko was gone. He was back in Moscow and unavailable to testify. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had to move fast on Pelton. They needed a confession. They needed it before word reached Moscow that Yurchenko had exposed him. On Sunday morning, November 24, 1985, Federal Bureau of Investigation agents called Ronald Pelton. They asked him to meet at the Annapolis Hilton at 9:15 in the morning. They said they were investigating a national security matter. Pelton agreed. He drove to the hotel and walked into room 317. Two Federal Bureau of Investigation agents waited. These were David Faulkner and another agent. Both were dressed casually. No weapons were visible. The room had been prepared carefully. In fact, multiple rooms were set up as an interrogation site. However, it did not look like one. The environment was comfortable and non-threatening. The agents wanted Pelton to feel safe and talk freely. They began with a hypothetical story about a former National Security Agency official. This official had sold secrets to the Soviets. The details were precise, covering places, dates, and amounts. Everything was included except the name. They left out Pelton's name, letting him fill in the blanks himself. Pelton listened. He initially denied everything. Then he started talking, hypothetically, saying the story did not apply to him. However, gradually, hour by hour, his denials weakened. About 1 hour into the interview, Pelton began admitting things. He admitted that he had sold intelligence information to the Soviet Committee for State Security. He also admitted that he had received money and met with them in Vienna. The confession flowed easily. He made more damaging admissions in a second interview that night. The agents asked about specific projects. Pelton admitted providing information about Project A. This was the code name for Ivy Bells in court documents. He also admitted revealing details about the National Security Agency's signals intelligence capabilities. These capabilities included Soviet communications intercepts and code-breaking abilities. Pelton revealed everything. Pelton signed a confession. 5 hours after walking into room 317, he was under arrest. Shortly after midnight on Monday, November 25th, Federal Bureau of Investigation agents placed Ronald William Pelton in handcuffs. He was 44 years old. He was a former National Security Agency specialist, a Soviet spy, and a traitor. The arrest made headlines immediately. Federal prosecutors moved quickly. They charged Pelton with 3 counts of espionage. They also charged him with 1 count of conspiracy. Additionally, he faced 1 count of unauthorized disclosure of classified communications information. The case was brought before the United States District Court for the District of Maryland. The judge assigned was Herbert F. Murray. The prosecutors included Breckinridge Wilcox, the United States Attorney. Robert N. McDonald and John G. Douglas served as assistant United States attorneys. The defense attorney was Fred Warren Bennett, a federal public defender. Bennett received security clearance to access the classified material Pelton allegedly sold. The government provided him top secret access. However, he could not discuss it publicly. The trial setup was extraordinary. More than a dozen earphones dangled from the jury box. 5 television monitors were placed strategically. United States Marshals guarded every entrance. This level of security was unprecedented for a civilian criminal trial. The proceedings would require playing classified audio tapes. They would also involve discussing top-secret operations. Furthermore, the trial would reveal capabilities that America had never publicly acknowledged. The trial was set to begin in May 1986. This allowed 5 months to prepare. The government faced a dilemma. They needed to prosecute someone for revealing secrets without revealing more secrets in the process. They questioned how to hold a public trial about classified information. The Classified Information Procedures Act, known as CIPA, provided some framework. However, this was uncharted territory. The trial would expose more about National Security Agency capabilities than any previous public proceeding in American history. In May 1986, jury selection began at the United States District Court in Baltimore. 79 prospective jurors arrived in Judge Herbert Murray's courtroom. The process was unusual. Initial questioning happened as a group. This helped determine who had legitimate reasons for excusal. Afterwards, individual interviews took place in the judge's chambers. This was standard procedure for highly publicized cases. Potential jurors might have formed opinions. Each prospective juror walked to chambers and was questioned privately. The process took a full week. Finally, 12 jurors were selected. There were 7 men and 5 women. The trial began on May 28, 1986, with opening statements. Prosecutor John Douglas stood at the podium facing the jury. He had spent 18 months building this case. Now was the moment to make it real. Douglas described the National Security Agency's ability to exploit, process, and analyze coded Soviet communications. These included radio, microwave, and cable transmissions. These were communications traveling between terminal points. They connected Soviet military centers, civilian centers, and high-level authorities. For the first time in history, the United States government publicly acknowledged that it could break Soviet codes. Intelligence specialists were shocked. The National Security Agency traditionally refused to prosecute espionage cases. Doing so would expose capabilities in open court. However, the Reagan administration wanted a conviction. This was the worst intelligence loss in recent history. They were willing to reveal secrets to put Pelton away. Douglas laid out the case methodically. He detailed Pelton's background and his access. He also described Pelton's financial desperation. Pelton had only $6.80 in cash and $8 in checking. He had also filed for bankruptcy. This was followed by his contact with the Soviet embassy. This involved the telephone call, the meeting, and the Vienna trips. Douglas cited the $35,000 Pelton received. He also outlined the damage done. Donald R. Bacon testified early in the trial. He was Pelton's former National Security Agency superior. Bacon described the special compartment where Soviet specialists worked on intercepted communications. These communications came from the highest level authorities in the Soviet Union. The testimony revealed operational details never before publicly confirmed. William P. Crowell, Jr., head of the National Security Agency section that decodes and interprets Soviet signals, explained the damage. Obtaining information from the signal parameters file would allow the Soviets to capitalize on American weaknesses. They could also make changes in their signals. This would counter United States intelligence gathering activities. Prosecutors charged that Pelton had authored the top-secret signal parameters file. He then turned it over to the Soviets. The testimony continued. Federal Bureau of Investigation agent David Faulkner described the interrogation at the Annapolis Hilton. Faulkner explained how Pelton initially denied everything. Then Pelton talked hypothetically. Finally, he admitted his espionage activities. The confession was crucial. Without Vitaly Yurchenko available to testify, Pelton's own words became the prosecution's strongest evidence. Defense attorney Fred Warren Bennett argued the Federal Bureau of Investigation had tricked Pelton. He claimed they had coaxed incriminating statements. This was done without advising Pelton of his right to remain silent. They also did not provide him an attorney. But the agents had been careful. They were unarmed and wore casual clothes. There was no arrest or custody. It was just a voluntary conversation. The jury heard both sides. Then Pelton himself took the stand. His own testimony would seal his fate. On the witness stand, Ronald William Pelton attempted to minimize the damage he had caused. He admitted meeting with the Soviets. He also admitted receiving $35,000. Furthermore, he admitted revealing information about Project A, which was the code name for Ivy Bells. However, he claimed his knowledge was limited. He said he had only worked on the recording system. His memory was imperfect, he stated. He had even marked the wrong place on the map when showing the Soviets the tap's location. The prosecution pressed him on these claims. If his knowledge was so limited, why did the Soviets pay him $35,000? Why did they fly him to Vienna twice for multi-day debriefing sessions? Why did they consider him valuable enough to keep as a consultant even after he left the National Security Agency? Pelton admitted that people who serviced the tap might face personal jeopardy. This was an admission that his disclosures endangered American lives. Navy divers, submarine crews, and intelligence officers were all at risk. All this happened because Ronald Pelton needed money. The jury watched him closely. They saw an intelligent, lucid man with good recall. These were precisely the attributes that made him a damaging spy. He admitted feeling pressured by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. However, he acknowledged his statements were voluntary. He knew what he was saying. He knew the consequences. Yet, he chose to confess anyway. His testimony did him no favors. Prosecutor Douglas had depicted him accurately as a conniving wheeler dealer. He was a man who sold out his country for the price of a decent car. On June 5, 1986, after almost 14 hours of deliberation over 2 days, the jury reached its verdict. They found Pelton guilty on 4 of 5 charges. These included 1 count of espionage, 1 count of conspiracy to commit espionage, and 1 count of attempted espionage. He was also guilty of transmitting unauthorized communications intelligence information. He was acquitted on a 2nd espionage charge. This related to the 1980 Vienna trip. There was insufficient supporting evidence for that specific count. However, he was guilty on everything else that mattered. Pelton sat motionless as the verdict was read, showing no reaction or emotion. His daughter Paula and his estranged wife Judith sat behind the defense table. Both looked tense. Both had watched the trial destroy what remained of their family. Sentencing was scheduled for December. This gave 6 months to prepare impact statements. It allowed time to calculate the damage and determine appropriate punishment. Defense attorney Bennett would argue for leniency. He cited a personality breakdown and financial desperation. He claimed there was no malicious intent. He stated Pelton was just a man who made terrible choices under crushing pressure. The prosecution would argue for maximum punishment. They highlighted irrevocable damage to national security and betrayal of trust. They also pointed to endangering American lives and compromising billion-dollar intelligence operations. The trial lasted 3 weeks. It featured extraordinary public testimony from National Security Agency officials. There were unprecedented revelations about American intelligence capabilities. All these efforts were made to convict one man who sold secrets for $35,000. On December 16, 1986, the sentencing hearing took place. It was held at the United States District Court in Baltimore. Judge Herbert F. Murray presided over the session. The courtroom was packed with media, government officials, and Pelton's family. Everyone waited to hear how long the traitor would spend in prison. Defense attorney Fred Warren Bennett made his final plea. He described Pelton's personality breakdown. He also recounted the financial setbacks of the late 1970s. These were the desperate circumstances that drove Pelton to treason. He was a 14-year National Security Agency veteran who could not make ends meet on $24,000 a year. He was a man selling recreational vehicles on the side just to feed his family. He even volunteered at soup kitchens while betraying his country. Bennett argued that under a 30-year sentence, Pelton would serve approximately 20 years with good time credit. Life sentences, however, eliminate that possibility. They ensure an inmate dies in prison. Bennett questioned if that was justice for a man who broke under financial pressure. Prosecutor John Douglas countered with the damage assessment. He acknowledged that Pelton had cooperated after his arrest. Pelton had provided some information to help assess what the Soviets had learned. However, this cooperation could not undo the harm. Project A, also known as Ivy Bells, had been one of America's holiest of holy operations. It was a technological marvel and a strategic advantage. Billions of dollars had been spent developing it. Lives were risked maintaining it. It provided intelligence gold for 1 decade. All of this was destroyed because Ronald Pelton needed money. The signal parameters file alone gave the Soviets enough information. It allowed them to neutralize American signals' intelligence capabilities for years. Douglas reminded the judge that Pelton had placed his financial interests above national security. He had placed them above his oath and above his country. Judge Murray listened to both sides. Then he rendered his decision. Pelton received 3 concurrent life sentences, plus an additional 10 years. He also received a $100 fine. The sentences would run concurrently, not consecutively. In theory, with good behavior, Pelton might be eligible for parole after 10 years. However, Judge Murray's message was clear. This was a life sentence. Pelton would grow old in federal prison and possibly die there. The spy who had $6.80 in his pocket when he betrayed America would spend the rest of his productive life behind bars. This was for $35,000. United States Attorney Breckinridge Wilcox issued a statement praising the sentence. He said it would be difficult to overstate the enormity of Pelton's crimes. These included irrevocable damage to the nation's ability to obtain foreign intelligence. They also involved compromised sources and methods. There was a profound impact on future capabilities. Pelton had sold out America, and now he would pay. The courtroom emptied. Pelton was led away in handcuffs. He became federal inmate number 229-14037. His destination was Federal Correctional Institution, Allenwood. This was a medium security facility in Pennsylvania. He would serve nearly 30 years. This was almost as long as he had been free before his arrest. This was the price of treason, the cost of desperation, and the consequences of selling $6.80 worth of integrity for $35,000 in Soviet money. Ronald William Pelton spent 29 years, 11 months, and 24 days in federal prison. He was incarcerated at Federal Correctional Institution, Allenwood in Pennsylvania for most of his sentence. In 2014, he was transferred to a halfway house. He then moved to home confinement for the final months. On November 24th, 2015, exactly 30 years after his arrest, his sentence expired. He walked free at age 74. He was a different man than the one who had entered prison. He was quieter, more mellow, and full of regrets. He had converted to Catholicism in prison. He found solace in confession. A priest assured him he could unburden himself in complete privacy. He played piano during Mass. He used his musical talents in service of something larger than himself. His daughter Pamela wrote after his death that he had disappeared from her life when she was 19. He returned when she was nearly 50. 3 decades were stolen by his choices. His son, Ronald M. Pelton, died in 2021 while Pelton was still alive. He lived to see one of his children die, a father's worst nightmare. On September 6, 2022, Ronald William Pelton died at a nursing home in Frederick, Maryland. He was 80 years old. The cause of death was cancer. His daughter, Paula Strand, confirmed his death. He had lived 7 years as a free man after his release. These were 7 years to reconcile with his family. They were 7 years to reflect on what he had done. These were 7 years he never would have had without the bargain he made in January 1980. The damage Ronald Pelton caused cannot be fully calculated. Operation Ivy Bells ended in 1981. This happened when the Soviets retrieved the recording device. The tap had provided intelligence gold for 1 decade, and now it was gone. The technology was displayed in Moscow. This served as proof of American espionage in Soviet territorial waters. It became a propaganda victory for the Soviet Union. The signal parameters file he provided gave the Soviets a roadmap. It outlined American signals intelligence capabilities. They learned which signals had been cracked. They also learned which codes were vulnerable and which communications were being monitored. This advantage allowed them to adjust. They could protect their communications and neutralize years of National Security Agency work. The broader intelligence community suffered as well. Pelton revealed details about listening posts around the world. He also exposed satellite intercept capabilities and code-breaking techniques. Every secret he sold required billions of dollars to replace. This meant new methods, new technologies, and new approaches. Some capabilities, however, could never be replaced. The psychological damage was even worse. Questions arose about how many other National Security Agency employees might be selling secrets. Concerns also grew about how many other financially desperate analysts had access to classified information. The 1980s became known as the Year of the Spy. It saw multiple arrests and multiple traitors. A cascade of betrayals followed. These included Aldrich Ames at the Central Intelligence Agency and Robert Hansen at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Jonathan Pollard sold secrets to Israel. The John Walker family spy ring also emerged, along with Christopher Boyce and Andrew Dalton Lee. Ronald Pelton was one name among many. However, his damage stood out. He needed no documents. He simply possessed an extraordinary memory. He had 14 years of secrets stored in his head. He walked into the Soviet embassy with $6.80. He walked out having sold America's submarine secrets for $35,000. What drives a man to betray his country? Financial. Desperation certainly played a role. Pelton filed for bankruptcy with $6.80 cash and $8 in his checking account. He owned 4 broken cars, a $10 watch, and a bowling ball. These were his most pathetic assets. However, other people faced financial hardship without committing treason. What made Pelton different? Perhaps it was the erosion of his values. He had served 14 years at the National Security Agency. He had seen how the agency worked. He knew its secrets. Perhaps exposure to so many secrets made him cynical. It made him think everyone was cheating. Everyone was lying. Everyone was looking out for themselves. So, why should not he do the same? Or perhaps it was simpler than that. Pride. He was a man who wanted to prove he could be successful. He had known poverty growing up. He had worked hard, but never gotten ahead. He had tried legitimate business ventures and failed every time. The Soviet money offered him validation. It was proof he had value. It was proof someone would pay for what he knew. $35,000 was more than 1 year's National Security Agency salary. It was more than he had ever earned legally in a single year. It felt like success, like finally winning. It was like making the big score he had always promised himself. The fact that it required betraying his oath, his country, his colleagues, and the American people somehow became secondary. The need for validation overwhelmed everything else. This illustrates classic spy psychology. It was not ideology or beliefs. It was just ego and desperation mixed together. This toxic combination creates traitors. If you found this story compelling, this channel has hundreds of other Cold War espionage documentaries just like it. Stories of spies who sold out their countries, operations that changed history, secrets that stayed hidden for decades until someone talked. Each story is researched thoroughly. Each detail is verified from multiple sources. Each documentary is designed to take you inside the world of intelligence operations during the most dangerous era in modern history. The Cold War produced more spies, more secrets, and more betrayals than any other period. We cover them all here. hit that subscribe button if you want more content like this. Ring the notification bell so you do not miss new uploads. We post regularly, and every video digs deep into a different espionage case. Leave a comment below telling us which spy story you want to see next. We read every comment and take suggestions seriously. Like this video if the story of Ronald Pelton surprised you. If learning about Operation Ivy Bells shocked you. Consider that a man with just $6.80 sold submarine secrets for $35,000. This betrayal made us realize how vulnerable our intelligence systems truly are. Share this with anyone interested in Cold War history, espionage, intelligence operations, or true crime. This is the kind of story that needs to be remembered. Not celebrated, but remembered. Understanding how spies operate, what motivates betrayal, and how nations protect their secrets teaches us something important. It teaches us about human nature, loyalty, and the price of desperation. It also shows why some people, when faced with impossible choices, make the worst possible decision. Ronald Pelton made that decision in January 1980. He spent 30 years in prison for it. He died at age 80, carrying the weight of his betrayal. That is the price of treason. It is the cost of selling your soul for $35,000. This is what happens when you walk into an enemy embassy with $6.80. You walk out having destroyed one of your nation's most valuable intelligence operations. Thanks for watching.